Good afternoon, this is the All Right Now CRC400 training video. The first part of the video we're going to walk you through the setup and configuration of the CRC400 itself. So here we have a typical CRC400, it's actually called a CRC412 because you have two boards in it. This is the master and this is the slave, and this here is the power supply. Everything we're about to show you is actually in the CRC400 manual itself, so if you get confused at all, just refer to this. And we recommend that you actually take one of these with you on site, printed off. It's amazing how useful it is to have it with you. The first thing we're going to do is configure the dip switches on the master and the slave board so that they communicate correctly. You'll notice here, these dip switches are numbered 1 to 8. Again, this is all referenced in page 5.1 in the CRC400 manual. Dip switch 8 being on, to the right is off, to the left is on as you look at the numbers. Dip switch 8 means this is a master board. And there can only be one master board in any chain of CRC400s. And the maximum number of slave devices you can have connected to one master is 31. Okay, so having configured the master, the next thing on the master board that you need to configure is the number of slave devices that are connected to in the chain of CRC400s. The important thing to note is that it is the first 5 switches that tell the master board how many slave devices are connected. These switches 1 to 5 work in binary, so you must be familiar with binary, and there is a document explaining how binary works if you're not familiar with it on the Dropbox folder. In binary then, switch 1 is either a 0 or 1, switch 2 is either 0 or 2, switch 3 is 0 or 4, switch 4 is 0 or 8, and switch 5 is 0 or 16. So you'll see on here, on this master, that this is switch 1 is off and switch 2 is on, and all the other switches 3 and 4 and 5 are off, which means that this is saying that there are 2 boards connected, 1, 2. That's everything on the master board. We're now going to go on to the slave board. The important thing to remember on the slave board is that the numbering of slaves starts at 2. So you'll notice here, switch 1 is off, switch 2 is on, and 3, 4 and 5 are all off, which means that this is board number 2. You'll notice also that switch number 8 is off, which indicates that this is a slave board and not a master board. This setup here is a very simple configuration. This is 2 boards which will work with 2 readers. However, if you have a long chain of CRC400s, it's important that you remember that each board, irrespective of whether it's actually got a reader attached, has got a number, and that number is sequential with no gaps in. For example, if you have another 4 slave devices attached to this, this is number 2, the next one would be 3, the next one would be 4, the next one would be 5, and the next one would be 6. Each board that is configured with a default power supply of 5 volts. Each board can be supplied with either 5 volts or 12 volts. All this information can be found on page 4.4 of the CRC400 manual. If you need to change it from 5 volts to 12 volts, for example for a maglock, then here's how you do it. So the first thing you need to do is you need to unscrew the board. Just remove all the 3 screws normally. And then on the back of the board you'll see the link switch. And if you can see that, you can see that by default it's 5 volts and it says 12 volts there on the card. And just take that out obviously as normal. And connect it across the 2 pins for 12 volts. Okay, the next stage of configuration of the board is configuring the jumper settings. There are 3 jumpers, 1, 2 and 3, and this can all be found on page 5.2 of the CRC400 manual. Jumper setting 1 enables you to test any reader to make sure you're getting the right response from all the connections that you've made. Jump switch 2 sets the board in Wiegand mode as opposed to clock and data, and jumper switch 3 allows a card to open a door if the connection between the CRC400 and the leisure management software, for example, is dropped. Jumper setting 1 sets the CRC400 in test mode. We always set jumper setting 1 as on at this stage so that you can test all of the equipment connected to this particular board without a validated credential. Okay, so you've now done the basic configuration and you're ready to install the CRC400 on each door or leg. So here we have a typical standard configuration that we previously set up, and we'll now go through each component in turn. Okay, so first of all, here we have the CRC400. Obviously it's grey, not white, but exactly the same thing. You've got two cards, you've got the master, the slave, and here you've got the power supply. Here you have a weekend reader, push to exit button, standard mag lock, emergency door release, and here you have the connection to the PC, which at the moment is running the test software. Okay, so the first thing obviously you're going to do is connect up the power supply. Normally this would connect through these holes here, one of these holes to which you'd fit a grommet and feed the wire through and fit up to the standard power supply connections. Okay, so the next thing to do is to configure the reader. We've set this up for Wiegand, but you can also do RS232 or clock and data. The key thing to remember with a Wiegand reader, which is connected into these ports here, is that jumper 2 needs to be on. That's off, and that is on. All the information on connecting the readers can be found from page 4.3 in the CRC400 manual. Okay, the next thing you're going to do is to wire in the maglock. You can find in details of how to wire this on page 4.7 of the CRC400 manual, and you may also need to refer to the specific wiring diagram in your Dropbox folder. Okay, so as you can see, we wire in the maglock into the emergency door release, and from the emergency door release into the CRC400. If you did need to wire in a key switch, you would wire that in serial with the emergency door release into the CRC400. Okay, so the key thing to remember about the emergency door release that we standardise on is that the normally open and the normally closed are the opposite meaning to what you would expect. So you need to wire into the normally open, although this is actually a normally closed contact for it to work. The final element is the push to exit button. You can find details about this on page 4.7 of the CRC400 manual. It's a very straightforward pair of wires. Right, you're now ready to turn the power on, so let's turn the power on. You'll notice that on each one of the boards there's a light flashing. That's because we have two boards in this CRC400. If you only had one board, i.e. just a master, you wouldn't notice a light on. If you have more than one board and the lights don't come on, then that indicates there's some sort of configuration issue, and that is probably to do with the way that you've numbered either the master or one of the individual connected slaves. Right, we're now ready to test everything. It's all working. Notice that we've got jumper 1 on, which means that any card will work with it as long as it's a valid type of card, i.e. it's a proximity card. So, leaps, maglock releases. You'll notice that there's a 3-second delay when jumper switch is on, 1 is on. You won't get that when you take jumper 1 off. If you've got more than one CRC400 in serial, the CRC400s between themselves communicate via RS485, and that's what this is. And you take a 3-core pair of wires, 3-core wires that go from the last CRC slave device in this box, last CRC400 slave device in the first CRC400, to the first slave device R8485 connection in the next CRC400. And so on. So if I was connecting this box to another, I'd put the RS485 in here, and that would continue on. An RS485 will connect over up to 1200 metres, although we don't recommend you doing it for much more than 100 metres. You need to have a laptop with you running at least Windows 8.1, on which you have the URI software, which will be provided for you and is in your Dropbox folder. So you double click on the URI software. This is connected via a USB to serial RS232 port into the back of the CRC400 chain that you're looking at. click Setup, and then click Connect. And then you see here we've got one master, one slave, and over here it's telling us that we have a slave device with a 32-bit WeGAN device connected to it. Then the final part of the test is to actually test a card and make sure that the number is coming up. And if you then look at the software, you'll see here 20006672 is the card number that's being read. And that is how you then know that the communication link between the CRC400 and the PC is correct, and therefore any issue with the readers you know has something to do with the leisure management software to which you've been connected.